It is the year 2026. As we look across the landscape of global industry, one symbol remains more pervasive, more scrutinized, and more financially dominant than almost any other in history. A simple fruit with a single bite taken out of it. Today, Apple Inc. is not just a company, it is a geopolitical force, a cultural gatekeeper, and a $3 trillion testament to the power of design and ecosystem locking. But the polished, minimalist perfection we see today is a mask. Beneath the glass and aluminum of Apple Park lies a history of brutal failure, high-stakes betrayal, and a series of near-extinction events that should have ended the company a dozen times over. This is not just a corporate history, it is a 50-year saga of how humanity's relationship with technology was forged in a garage and refined in a boardroom. To understand Apple, we must look past the stock price and the keynote stage. We must go back to the beginning, to the collision of two very different Steves and a world that didn't yet know it needed a personal computer. The story begins in 1971. In the fertile soil of Northern California's Silicon Valley. Before there was an Apple, there was a partnership built on a blue box. Steve Wozniak, a quiet engineering genius who could see logic circuits in his dreams, had discovered a way to hack the AT&T telephone network. By replicating the exact 2600 Hz frequency used by the phone company's internal switching systems, Wozniak created a device that allowed for free long-distance calls. While Wozniak saw it as a brilliant technical prank, his friend Steve saw something else. Jobs, a college dropout with an uncanny ability to spot the commercial value in abstract ideas, realized they could sell these boxes. They made thousands of dollars, but more importantly, they learned a fundamental lesson. Wozniak could build the impossible, and Jobs could make people pay for it. By 1975, the Homebrew Computer Club was the epicenter of a new underground movement. These were hobbyists who believed that computers, then massive machines owned only by governments and corporations, should be accessible to individuals. Wozniak, inspired by the club, designed a simple circuit board that could display characters on a TV screen. This was the Apple I. It was a masterpiece of efficiency, using a fraction of the chips required by other designs. Jobs convinced Wozniak to form a company. They sold their most prized possessions, Jobs his Volkswagen bus and Wozniak his HP calculator to fund the production. On April 1, 1976, Apple Computer was officially born. The Apple I was a success in the hobbyist world, but it was the Apple II, released in 1977, that changed the world. This was the first computer designed to look like a consumer appliance. It was plastic, it was sleek, and it supported color. But the true driver of its success was the creation of VisiCalc, the first digital spreadsheet. Suddenly, small business owners realized they didn't need a mainframe, they needed an Apple. This led to one of the most successful IPOs in history in 1980, making both Steves millionaires many times over. However, success brought internal conflict. As Apple grew, it needed professional management. Jobs recruited John Sculley, the CEO of Pepsi, with the legendary challenge, "Do you want to sell sugared water for the rest of your life, or do you want to come with me and change the world?" But Jobs himself was becoming a polarizing figure. His obsession with the Macintosh, a project inspired by a visit to Xerox PARC where he saw the first graphical user interface and mouse, put him at odds with the rest of the company. The Macintosh, launched in 1984 with the famous Ridley Scott-directed Super Bowl ad, was a revolutionary piece of design, but a commercial disappointment. It was underpowered and expensive. The failure of the Macintosh led to a power struggle between Jobs and Sculley. In 1985, the board of directors sided with Sculley. Steve Jobs, the man who started Apple in his parents' garage, was fired from his own company. He sold all but one share of his stock and left to start Next Computer and invest in Pixar. What followed for Apple was a decade of slow, painful decline.
Through the late 80s and early 90s, Apple rested on the laurels of the Macintosh, charging high prices while Microsoft's Windows began to catch up. Under a succession of CEOs, John Sculley, Michael Spindler, and Gil Amelio, Apple lost its way. The company bloated its product line with dozens of confusing models like the Performa, Quadra, and Centris. They wasted hundreds of millions on failed projects like the Newton message pad. By 1996, Apple was 90 days away from bankruptcy. Its market share had plummeted to less than 4%. In a desperate move, Gil Amelio decided to buy Steve Jobs' company Next for its operating system. This brought Jobs back to Apple as an advisor. Within months, Jobs staged a boardroom coup, ousted Amelio, and became the interim CEO. The return of Jobs in 1997 is widely considered the greatest second act in business history. He immediately slashed the product line by 70%, launched the Think Different campaign, and struck an unlikely $150 million alliance with Microsoft to ensure Apple's survival. In 1998, the iMac G3 was released. With its translucent, bondy blue casing, it proved that Apple still had its design soul. But Jobs was looking beyond the computer. He envisioned the Mac as a digital hub for a new digital lifestyle. In 2001, Apple launched the iPod. It wasn't the first MP3 player, but its integration with the failure of the Macintosh led to a power struggle between Jobs and Sculley. In 1985, the board of directors sided with Sculley. Steve Jobs, the man who started Apple in his parents' garage, was fired from his own company. He sold all but one share of his stock and left to start Next Computer and invest in Pixar. What followed for Apple was a decade of slow, painful decline. Through the late 80s and early 90s, Apple rested on the laurels of the Macintosh, charging high prices while Microsoft's Windows began to catch up. Under a succession of CEOs, John Sculley, Michael Spindler, and Gil Amelio, Apple lost its way. The company bloated its product line with dozens of confusing models like the Performa, Quadra, and Centris. They wasted hundreds of millions on failed projects like the Newton message pad. By 1996, Apple was 90 days away from bankruptcy. Its market share had plummeted to less than 4%. In a desperate move, Gil Amelio decided to buy Steve Jobs' company Next for its operating system. This brought Jobs back to Apple as an advisor. Within months, Jobs staged a boardroom coup, ousted Amelio, and became the interim CEO. The return of Jobs in 1997 is widely considered the greatest second act in business history. He immediately slashed the product line by 70%, launched the Think Different campaign, and struck an unlikely $150 million alliance with Microsoft to ensure Apple's survival. In 1998, the iMac G3 was released. With its translucent, bondy blue casing, it proved that Apple still had its design soul. But Jobs was looking beyond the computer. He envisioned the Mac as a digital hub for a new digital lifestyle. In 2001, Apple launched the iPod. It wasn't the first MP3 player, but its integration with iTunes made it the first one that was easy to use. The iPod didn't just save Apple, it transformed the music industry. Now, pause for a moment and think back to your own history with technology. I want to ask you, what was the first Apple product you ever owned, or the first one that made you realize the world was changing? Was it the click wheel of an iPod, or perhaps the first time you swiped a finger across an iPhone screen? Take a second to remember that feeling of a device that felt like it came from the future. That feeling of the future became Apple's primary export. In 2007, Jobs stood on stage and introduced the iPhone. He called it 3 products in one: a widescreen iPod, a revolutionary mobile phone, and a breakthrough internet communicator. In reality, it was a pocket computer that destroyed the incumbents like BlackBerry and Nokia overnight. The App Store, launched a year later, created an entirely new economy, making Apple the most valuable company on the planet. The iPad followed in 2010, but the triumph was shadowed by tragedy. Steve Jobs, who had been battling pancreatic cancer for years, passed away in October 2011. The world wondered if Apple could survive without its visionary. The mantle passed to Tim Cook, the operations expert who had quietly built Apple's massive global supply chain. Under Cook, Apple moved from a company of revolutionary leaps to a company of unbeatable scale. Cook didn't try to be Jobs. Instead, he optimized Apple into a profit-generating machine. He launched the Apple Watch and AirPods, which became billion-dollar industries in their own right. He transitioned Apple's revenue away from just hardware and toward services, iCloud, Apple Music, and the App Store. By 2018, Apple became the first American company to reach a $1 trillion market cap, and by 2022, it hit $3 trillion.
One of the most significant technical shifts of the modern era happened in 2020, the transition to Apple Silicon. By designing its own chips, Apple broke its dependence on Intel and achieved a level of performance and battery life that the PC industry is still struggling to match. This gave Apple total control over its entire stack, from the silicon to the software to the hardware. As we stand here in 2026, Apple is facing its most complex chapter yet. The Vision Pro has signaled Apple's entry into spatial computing, a gamble that suggests the era of the screen in your pocket might eventually give way to an interface in your eyes. But the company also faces unprecedented challenges. Governments in the US and Europe are aggressively pursuing antitrust cases, targeting the walled garden that has been the source of Apple's wealth. The supply chain is being forced to shift away from China due to geopolitical tensions, and the race for artificial intelligence has seen Apple take a more cautious, privacy-first approach compared to its rivals. Before we conclude, I have one more question for you. As AI and augmented reality begin to reshape our daily lives, do you think Apple will remain the leader of the next 50 years, or has the walled garden finally become too small for the future we are heading into? The history of Apple is a history of contradictions. It is a company that preaches rebellion but demands total control. It is a company that focuses on the individual but operates at a scale that is almost impossible to comprehend. It has been a garage startup, a corporate failure, a phoenix rising from the ashes, and now a global empire. Whether you love the brand or find its dominance concerning, there is no denying that the world we live in was designed in large part by the people in Cupertino. This has been a deep dive into the evolution of an icon. If you value this kind of deep researched, analytical storytelling that looks at the intersection of business, history, and technology, then you are in the right place. This content is brought to you by The Capstone. Our mission is to provide you with the most comprehensive insights into the forces that shape our modern world. If you enjoyed this journey through the history of Apple, please consider subscribing to The Capstone. Your support allows us to continue spending the hundreds of hours required for the deep research that goes into every script. Click the subscribe button, turn on notifications, and join us for our next deep dive. Thank you for listening, and we will see you in the next one.